They called it the golden age of Hollywood, when gods and goddesses walked among mortals, their faces frozen in celluloid immortality. Clark Gable's rakish grin, Marlon Brando's smoldering intensity, Bette Davis's razor-sharp wit, John Wayne's unshakable presence. America watched them through darkened theaters, believing in the magic, the perfection, the untouchable glamour. But there was one man who sat closer than any camera ever could. Close enough to see beyond the carefully constructed illusions, close enough to know a truth that would shatter the fantasy forever. Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late-night television, spent 30 years across a desk from these legends, and what he discovered there was never meant to be revealed. The lights were hot, the cameras were rolling, and the audience applauded on cue, but in that small space between host and guest, in those few feet of proximity that millions never experienced, Carson endured something no one could have imagined. The gods of the silver screen carried with them the unmistakable evidence of their humanity, and sometimes that evidence announced itself long before they even sat down. This is the story Carson never told publicly, the secret he carried through thousands of interviews, the truth about what it really meant to sit face to face with immortality and discover it smelled nothing like the dream. When Orson Welles appeared on The Tonight Show, the audience saw exactly what they expected to see, a titan of cinema, the boy genius who had revolutionized filmmaking with Citizen Kane, now transformed into an elder statesman of the arts. They saw the black suit that had become his trademark, the dramatic gestures, the booming voice that could fill any room. Johnny Carson saw all of this too, but he also experienced something the cameras could never capture. By the 1970s, Welles had become a man of enormous physical presence, his body expanding to match the scope of his ambitions and appetites. The black suit he wore wasn't just a fashion choice. It was architectural necessity, a vast tent of fabric attempting to contain a frame that had long since abandoned moderation. When Welles lowered himself into the guest chair, the small space between him and Carson became its own ecosystem, a dense atmosphere that existed nowhere else in the studio. The scent arrived before any words were exchanged, a complex layering of elements that told the story of a life lived without compromise. Havana cigars, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a week, had left their mark on every thread of that rarely clean suit. But beneath the dry, acrid smoke was something far more challenging, the unmistakable presence of brandy that had been consumed so regularly and so abundantly that it had become part of Welles's very biology. Seeping through his pores under the merciless heat of the studio lights, Carson had developed techniques for these moments, shallow breathing through the mouth, strategic angles of the head, the performance of attention while actually fighting a desperate battle for breathable air. The worst moments came during Welles's magic tricks, when the great director would lean forward with childlike enthusiasm, bringing his massive, perspiring head within inches of Carson's face to demonstrate some sleight of hand. The safety distance vanished entirely, and Carson had to marshal every ounce of professional discipline not to recoil. The audience at home saw concentration and fascination, but the truth was far more visceral. Carson's eyes would water, not from emotion, but from the sheer concentration of accumulated cigarette ash, fermented alcohol, and the inevitable consequence of a body pushed to its limits night after night. After Welles departed to thunderous applause, the expensive velvet chair he'd occupied told its own story, marked by moisture and an odor so persistent that industrial chemicals couldn't fully erase it. Some night, Carson simply requested a replacement chair rather than sit anywhere near the ghost of that visit. Bette Davis arrived on The Tonight Show set like visiting royalty, and in many ways that's exactly what she was. The sharp intelligence, the devastating honesty, the refusal to suffer fools. These were the qualities that had made her a legend, and they remained undimmed by time. The audience adored her, hanging on every caustic observation and deliciously scandalous Hollywood memory. Carson admired her tremendously, but admiration didn't make the physical reality any easier to endure. Davis was a woman of her era, and her era had been built on cigarettes. Not the occasional social smoke, but the constant chain-smoking devotion that defined an entire generation of film stars. The camera might have captured the elegance of smoke curling from her fingers, but it couldn't convey what Carson experienced at close range. The smell of dead cigarettes had worked its way into every fiber of her being, her hair, her skin, the expensive evening gowns she wore for appearances. It was the scent of thousands upon thousands of cigarettes, each one leaving its mark, accumulating into something that couldn't be washed away or covered up. Though Davis certainly tried. The thick foundation and powder she applied to maintain her ageless appearance created its own challenges under the brutal heat of the stage lights, slowly melting and releasing the waxy, chemical smell of vintage cosmetics mixed with desperate preservation. She masked all of this with perfume so powerful it could have stripped paint. But the sweetness only created a strange war of scents, none emerging victorious. Davis had a habit of leaning in close during interviews, bringing her face near when making a particularly sharp point or sharing a confidential story. And in those moments Carson received the full force of her breath, laden with smoke and time and the residue of countless cigarettes. He never flinched, never showed anything but rapt attention. But staff members noticed the small handkerchief he kept nearby, pre-treated with peppermint oil, that she would raise to his nose during commercial breaks. Davis remained completely unaware of the effect she had, having long since lost the ability to smell what had become her natural state. When she left the set, industrial fans had to run for 15 minutes before the next segment could begin, clearing the air of the ghost she'd left behind. Marlon Brando represented something entirely different, a deliberate rejection of Hollywood's superficial standards and social conventions. He was the king of method acting, the man who had transformed cinema with his raw, naturalistic performances. And he brought that same commitment to authenticity into every aspect of his life, including personal hygiene, which he considered an artificial construct. Carson only interviewed Brando a handful of times because Brando genuinely despised talk shows, viewing them as theaters of phoniness, but those rare appearances left an indelible impression. Brando's scent wasn't born from cigarettes or alcohol, but from a philosophical position that soap and deodorant stripped away a person's essential nature. For someone committed to finding truth in performance, this might have made perfect sense. But for Johnny Carson sitting 3 feet away, it created an experience unlike any other. The smell was organic and primal, the accumulation of days without bathing, old leather worn soft, the musk of the many dogs Brando kept, food remnants on clothing worn repeatedly. When Brando settled into the guest chair, his undeniable charisma and piercing eyes couldn't distract from the wave of natural human scent that came with him. The truly difficult moments arrived when Brando became animated in conversation, leaning forward with passion to make a point, and Carson would receive a blast of breath that carried the evidence of Brando's eccentric eating habits raw. Garlic and onions consumed before the interview, whether accidentally or deliberately to keep people at distance. Carson had to maintain complete composure, nodding thoughtfully while internally fighting the natural urge to turn away. Brando was the ultimate contradiction, a man of stunning beauty and talent who rejected every conventional expectation of how that beauty should be maintained. For Carson, it was a test of professionalism unlike any other, sitting across from genius while drowning in the consequences of that genius's rejection of basic hygiene. Judy Garland's story carried a different weight entirely, because her scent spoke not of rebellion or carelessness, but of genuine suffering and physical collapse. She was Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, the voice that had sung over the rainbow into America's heart. But by the late 1960s, when she appeared on Carson's show, she had become a tragic figure battling addictions and illnesses that were slowly destroying her. The smell she carried was heartbreaking in its complexity. There was the desperate attempt at freshness, the mints and chewing gum and mouthwash used frantically to cover what couldn't be concealed, the presence of hard liquor and sedatives that had soaked so deeply into her system they emerged through her breath and skin. Her clothes carried the musty dampness of a life in chaos, hotel rooms and constant movement, personal care becoming impossible luxury. Beneath everything was the scent of sickness itself, a body giving up under the assault of too much medication and too little nutrition, the smell of decay that Carson recognized immediately as something far beyond simple neglect. During their 1968 interview, Garland leaned on Carson constantly, touching his arm for reassurance, bringing her face close when telling stories about her children and her struggles. And each time, Carson had to receive that mixture of scents, while showing nothing but compassion and patience. There was a moment when she spoke about singing over the rainbow and searching for that place of peace and happiness. And her breath carried such a heavy burden of alcohol and drugs that the contrast became almost unbearable. The angelic voice singing of beautiful dreams, the breath revealing the nightmare of addiction. Carson never showed anything but kindness, using tissues and cold water after she left to try to shake the nausea, but mostly feeling overwhelming sadness for a talent consumed by its own demons. Not long after that interview, Garland died, and Carson carried the memory of those final visits as a reminder of how quickly Hollywood could burn through even its brightest stars. Richard Burton arrived in perfectly tailored suits, speaking with that magnificent Welsh voice about Shakespeare and poetry and the grand themes of existence, but underneath the intellectual veneer was a man whose alcoholism had become inseparable from his identity. Burton didn't just drink heavily, he had essentially transformed himself into a processing plant for whiskey and vodka, and his body announced this fact to anyone sitting nearby. The smell was unmistakable and overwhelming, pure alcohol emerging through every pore as his sweat carried the evidence of constant consumption. When Burton leaned forward to make a point or tell an amusing story, Carson received a concentrated blast of alcoholic fumes strong enough to create contact intoxication. The cigarettes Burton chain-smoked added another layer, but it was the combination with alcohol-saturated breath that created something truly unique, like cigarette butts soaking overnight in stale beer. Burton attempted to mask all of this with expensive cologne applied liberally, but luxury fragrance couldn't defeat the fundamental problem. It only created a more complex and somehow sadder scent, refinement struggling against ruin. Interviews with Burton showcased his brilliant mind and quick wit, but they also tested Carson's ability to maintain equilibrium, while Burton's characteristic habit of moving his face closed during passionate discussion turned the host into an unwilling participant in secondhand intoxication. Carson developed subtle techniques for creating distance, leaning back incrementally, turning toward Ed McMahon for interjections, calculating silently how much Burton had consumed before coming on stage, and whether he might actually lose consciousness mid-interview. When Burton died in 1984, Carson mourned a wasted talent, but privately he also remembered Burton as living proof that intelligence and charisma couldn't overcome the demons of addiction, and that sometimes the most refined exterior covered the most profound internal collapse. Shelley Winters brought chaos of an entirely different kind, not the tragedy of addiction, but the comedy of someone too frantically busy living to worry about mundane concerns like bathing or clean clothes. She was a talented actress with 2 Academy Awards and a larger-than-life personality, but she was also spectacularly disorganized in every aspect of personal maintenance. Winters didn't mean to smell. She simply had no time or inclination to address it. Her scent told the story of her lifestyle, the remains of hastily eaten meals clinging to expensive silk and fur, cold sandwiches and congealed butter, and spilled coffee, creating a sour, greasy mixture that intensified under the studio lights. The fur coats and velvet garments she favored were rarely if ever cleaned, and her sweat had soaked into these thick fabrics over time, creating the musty smell of decomposing protein. Like Bette Davis, Winters attempted to maintain appearances with heavy makeup and industrial-strength hairspray, but under the heat these chemicals mixed with the food smells and body odor to create something reminiscent of an abandoned restaurant kitchen. Interviews with Winters were chaotic events, because unlike other guests who sat relatively still, she was in constant motion, gesticulating wildly and shifting in her seat, and each movement released fresh waves of that accumulated scent. Carson maintained his composure through most of it, but there were moments when Winters' chaos broke through his professional facade. Once, while telling a dramatic story, she gestured so enthusiastically that a piece of cold cheese sandwich flew from her clothing and landed in Carson's ashtray, and he had to pretend it was intentional comedy rather than simple sloppiness. For Carson, Winters represented the smell of suppressed disorder, a talented woman drowning in her own impulsiveness. Walter Matthau was perhaps the only person on this list that Carson genuinely enjoyed despite the olfactory challenges, because Matthau was at least honest about his magnificent slovenliness. The scent Matthau brought wasn't terrifying or tragic, just persistently unpleasant in a way that somehow matched his comedic genius. Matthau played Oscar Madison, the messy slob in The Odd Couple. And according to Carson, the real Walter Matthau made Oscar look fastidious by comparison. He was a man defined by his passions, gambling, especially horse racing, and cheap food, consumed without ceremony. Every time Mathau appeared, he carried the accumulated evidence of where he'd been, usually arriving directly from the racetrack with sweat saturated by hot sun, and parking lot dust, and the distinctive smell of old damp money from hours of intense betting. His eating habits were atrocious, favoring heavily spiced onion sandwiches from street vendors, which transformed his breath into a simple but devastatingly effective biological weapon. When Mathau laughed, which was often because he was genuinely funny, waves of fermented onion breath would assault Carson's senses. The thick hair Mathau sported was perpetually greasy from lack of washing, and his clothes were worn for days without cleaning, because he simply didn't care about Hollywood's superficial standards. Carson handled Mathau differently than the others, turning the slovenliness into part of their comedic dynamic, teasing him about looking like he'd slept under stairs or lived in his car. Behind the jokes was a sincere fondness, but also the reality that Carson constantly had to adjust his position to maintain some distance from his friend's powerful natural presence. Mathau wasn't a bad person, just magnificently indifferent to personal maintenance, and Carson accepted this as the price of friendship with a comedic genius. Truman Capote brought profound sadness to these encounters because his scent marked the visible decline of a brilliant mind being destroyed by addiction and illness. Capote, the author of Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood, loved appearing on The Tonight Show, thriving in the spotlight and delighting in sharing scandalous stories. But with each passing year, Carson watched his talented friend deteriorate physically, and that deterioration announced itself through increasingly disturbing smells. Capote's body was swollen from substance abuse and alcohol, creating a strange chemical odor as medications were processed and excreted through his skin, mixed with sour sweat and the yeasty smell of physical systems in overload. His clothes, once impeccably fashionable, had become damp and musty, carrying the scent of shabby hotel rooms and drunken nights, with stubborn stains marking the collars and sleeves. Most horrifying was the smell of complete physical breakdown, as Capote's compromised health led to occasional loss of bodily control, creating the unmistakable scent of decay. In final interviews, Capote's voice had become high and shaky, his stories meandering and confused, and whenever he leaned close to whisper some bit of gossip, Carson had to face breath heavy with illness and the pungent evidence of a body shutting down. The audience saw Carson's sad, contemplative expression and thought he was simply empathizing with Capote's struggles, which was true, but he was also fighting against the deathly atmosphere that surrounded his friend. Carson never interrupted or showed discomfort, treating Capote with maximum respect and trying to preserve whatever dignity remained. When Capote died in 1984, Carson remembered him not just as a lost talent, but as a specific smell, the scent of genius consumed by demons, and a star that had slowly rotted in the guest chair. John Wayne brought the final chapter to this catalog, and his scent spoke not of carelessness, but of a hero being destroyed by his own choices. Wayne was an American icon, the Duke, the embodiment of masculine strength and cowboy values, and Carson deeply respected him. But respect couldn't eliminate what Wayne's lifetime of tobacco abuse had created. 5 or 6 packs daily of coarse roll-your-own cigarettes for decades had permeated everything Wayne owned, his cowboy clothes and wide-brimmed hats, and leather jackets all saturated with dense acidic smoke. The smell was so powerful that people claimed the air turned gray wherever Wayne went, his presence announced by tobacco before he even appeared. In his final Tonight Show appearances, Wayne was battling metastatic cancer, adding the chemical smell of treatment medications to the baseline tobacco stench, creating a sickly combination that Carson recognized as the scent of a body fighting until its last breath. When Wayne sat down heavily in the guest chair, smoke smell rushed over everything, but this time Carson felt no disgust, only deep sorrow. Wayne's voice had become hoarse and weak from the lung cancer, forcing him to lean forward to speak louder, and each time Carson faced breath so heavily laced with tobacco it seemed combustible. The tragic contrast was unavoidable, the icon of strength and masculinity being destroyed from within by his own habit. Carson never teased Wayne about this, steering conversations with maximum respect and letting the Duke tell his Western stories and memories of Hollywood's glory days, trying to preserve the legend in these final public moments. After Wayne left one time, Carson sat alone in the studio for a long while, the chair reeking of smoke, so badly the cleaning staff couldn't immediately treat it. But Carson didn't request a replacement. He just sat there breathing in what remained as a silent memorial. When John Wayne died in 1979, Carson remembered him as proof that even the greatest heroes have fatal weaknesses and that personal neglect can destroy anyone regardless of their legend. Johnny Carson completed his career having sat across from hundreds of the most famous people in the world, smiling through it all and keeping their secrets. These 9 guests represented the hidden truth about Hollywood's golden age, that the glamour captured on film often smelled very different in person. Carson endured it with professionalism and grace, never revealing publicly what he experienced in those close quarters, maintaining the illusion for audiences who wanted to believe in the magic. The lesson he learned, and never quite spoke aloud, was simple. The gods of the silver screen were entirely human, and sometimes that humanity announced itself in ways no camera could capture and no amount of stage lighting could conceal.